The Day the Dead Rose. Day 1. The Outbreak by A.R. Pearson. Performed by A.R. Pearson. Copyright 2019. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without the author's written permission. Warning. This book contains adult content, foul language, intense horror scenes, and extremely graphic material that will likely be too gory for many readers. Discretion is advised. Additionally, this is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidences are either products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, are coincidence, and likewise any actual places are created to benefit the story only and not intended to be factually correct. Chapter 2. Officer Miguel Gomez, Pismo Beach, 4:35 a.m. As with any rollover accident, it requires 2 tow trucks to roll the vehicle back onto its wheels. The first tow truck will use its cables and rigging to hold the truck in place, while the second truck pulls it back onto its wheels. This wasn't a major accident. It did, however, require 2 trucks to roll the Kenworth back over. It wasn't a long process either, and soon enough the truck was back on its wheels, ready to be towed away. Now all that remained was the little car that was smashed nose first into the center guardrail. The tow truck driver hooked chains from the car to his electric winch. After the rigging was in place, he began to drag the smashed car up onto the flatbed. Miguel watched him as he worked and noticed his face had a greenish tint to it. Miguel called out, "Hey man, you feel okay? You're not looking so good." He shrugged his shoulders like he was unsure. "Yeah, my stomach's pissed off, but I'll live." Curious, Miguel walked closer to get a better look at the tow truck driver. Before Miguel said anything else, the mic of his radio squawked to life. "Car 16, you got a copy?" He keyed up the mic and said, "Copy that, dispatch. This is Car 16, over." A woman's voice came back. "We got a code 14 versus transmission tower. Reported possible frontage road blockage on the southbound exit of Los Burros Road and State Route 101. Injuries are unknown. Can you respond? Over." He keyed up his mic and replied, "Dispatch, copy that. We're affirmative for your code 14, over." Miguel looked at the tow truck driver and said, "Well, we got another call. You got this under control?" He nodded and said, "I got it under control, boss. Go ahead." Miguel looked across the highway to his partner and best friend of more than 25 years, Officer Daniel Lewis. Because they were best friends before they joined up with the California Highway Patrol, Danny was only Officer Lewis during official calls. Any other time he was simply Danny. Miguel yelled out, "Code 2!" holding up 2 fingers. Officer Lewis didn't yell. Instead, he held up 2 fingers, letting Miguel know he was ready to roll. The 2 men began jogging back to the cruiser on opposite sides of the highway. About halfway, Officer Lewis stopped, bent over, and vomited on the shoulder of the highway. Miguel watched in shock as his best friend leaned on his knees while heaving last night's dinner onto the shoulder of the road. 5 years ago, Miguel may have heckled his best friend, maybe yelling some insult across the highway. However, now he had a whole new sense of compassion for being sick. 5 years ago, Miguel watched his wife suffer through unsuccessful treatments of chemotherapy. Sometimes he can still hear the sounds of her vomiting in their upstairs bathroom. And other times he still catches glances of her sickly pale face in the mirror, her thin lips twisted with discomfort. Any of these symptoms always seem to bring the pain back to the surface, almost like scratching a rash. Miguel made it to the cruiser first, despite being further away and having to cross the highway. He watched as Danny seemed to amble instead of walk, weaving in and out of his own path, staggering to the right, then back to the left. As he neared, Miguel could see the same greenish color as the tow truck driver. He studied his friend for a moment and said, "Damn, man, you don't look good at all. You better sit down before you fall down." Officer Lewis didn't speak, and it seemed to take all his focus just to put one foot in front of the other. Once Danny was safely inside, Miguel glanced to his friend and hoped he wouldn't be sick in the car. "Hey, you alright, man? Let me know if you're going to be sick, okay?" Miguel said. Danny shook his head, but not in regard to anything Miguel had said. It was more like he was trying to shake away the sickness. He shivered so severely his teeth chattered as he spoke. No, not really. I'm freezing." He crossed his arms over his chest and rubbed his shoulders, trying to warm himself up. Now he was truly beginning to worry his best friend. Should he stop and take him straight to the hospital? It was a hard decision, but ultimately he thought if anyone at the scene of the crash needed medical attention, it would likely be more life-threatening than Danny's flu bug. So reluctantly, he decided to assess the scene of the crash first. While en route, Miguel noticed a parked car on the right shoulder of the highway. It was too dark to tell what color the car was, but it was definitely a small car. He could, however, see a man on his knees, his right shoulder leaned against the passenger side rear quarter panel, his hands planted on the ground, holding him up while he vomited. The flashing lights reflected off the parked car as Miguel flew past. Before Miguel could spend any time thinking about the situation, he spotted two more cars. One was on the right side shoulder. The other was a few hundred yards beyond, only it was on the left side of the highway. There looked to be a shape in the driver's seat, hunched over the steering wheel. Miguel glanced at Danny. His stomach clenched up as he began to think the worst. Could this be one of those flu bugs that can kill if it's not treated fast enough? He was seriously conflicted about his decision not to take his partner to the hospital. The second car looked to be empty as Miguel flew by at over 80 miles an hour. Danny lightly snored from the passenger seat. In all their years, Danny had never once fell asleep on duty. Miguel's level of concern shot up another couple notches, if that were possible. Well, he was only 2 miles from the scene of the crash now, so he was fully committed with his decision. Miguel slowed down as he came upon the exit of the crash. There were two cars parked on the shoulder of the highway. One of them didn't seem to have any damage and was parked in the normal fashion. The other car, the closer one, had been hit from behind and was sitting askew, half blocking the exit to Los Burros Road. Fresh skid marks led off the road and down the steep embankment on the west side of Highway 101. A car rolled down the embankment and slammed into the transmission tower. Impact must have been hard, because the tower was now leaning substantially. Large divots were dug into the grass where the car rolled down the side of the highway. The crashed car faced south. Its headlights shone on the wild grass, making the crashed vehicle easy to spot in the darkness. Miguel exited the highway and parked at an angle facing east under the overpass. Miguel flipped the dome light on and checked on Danny in the passenger seat. His face wore a perpetual grimace, and he looked so very uncomfortable. The right side of his forehead pressed flat against the side window. He was sideways, twisted with his knees crammed in the corner where the dash met the door. Miguel put his hand on the back of his left shoulder, said, "Hey, partner, just stay put, okay? I'll take care of this, and we'll get you to the hospital, all right?" Then Miguel quickly exited the cruiser and made his way over to the crash blue Subaru. The driver's seat was empty with no one in the immediate vicinity. The car sat motionless. Steam poured out from under the smashed hood. It was wedged under the massive tower's ruined supports. The two towers' eastern steel supports bent inward so severely, what was left of them now used the car's fender as its foundation. The area under the power lines meandered between mowed grass and a bare, damp mixture of sandy soil. Miguel noticed a large patch of dirt and several small drops of what he suspected was blood. He pulled out his mag light and turned it on, lighting up the blackness. Miguel lost the trail after 6 or 7 paces when the maintained grass became wild and unkempt. The emerald green winter grass was only about 8 inches tall, but The darkness made it hard to spot anything hiding beneath it. Miguel stopped and scanned the grass ahead. There looked to be a shape laid out flat in front of him. Moving closer, he unlatched his sidearm and readied his hand on its textured carbon fiber grips. With his thumb, he flipped the safety off as he came to within 10 feet of the shape. He drew his sidearm and took aim on the shadow in the tall grass. His finger extended down the side of the cold steel barrel. The body lay face down and motionless, unconscious, or perhaps ready to spring a surprise attack. Regardless, Miguel would take no chances as he advanced with extreme caution. He called out with a firm voice as he slowly advanced. "I'm Officer Gomez. I'm here to help you. Can you hear me? Are you okay? I'm coming over. Please don't do anything stupid, like make any sudden movements, and I won't have to shoot you." Because the man was face down, Miguel was being much more cautious than he probably needed to be. The last thing he wanted was to stumble on a fugitive like a damn clumsy fool and wind up dead. There's nothing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose. Miguel had no way to know if the shadow in the tall grass was a wanted fugitive or not, and a man that faced the end of his free life if captured would be capable of almost anything, and Miguel wisely understood this. The man's left arm lay stretched out straight, and his right arm tucked under his chest. Miguel circled around and approached on the same side as the man's outstretched left arm. This way, if he had a weapon under him, he would have to roll over before he could use it against him. Miguel kicked the man's left wrist. It jiggled limply but went still. He nudged the left side of his ribs with the toe of his boot. There was still no movement. Miguel holstered his sidearm, kneeled down beside him, and checked his left wrist for a pulse. His pulse was slow and faint, but there was a pulse. He keyed up the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, it's a car 16 on scene. The driver is 1082 in need of a 1043 urgent. We also need utilities 1074 ASAP. Please set up a 9177 on State Route 101 both north and south of Los Burros Road. Over." Dispatch responded in the groggy voice. "Copy that. EMS is..." The lady's voice fought through a few weak coughs. Then she cleared her throat and tried to continue. "Code 6. Utilities. The voice on the other end of the radio trailed off into an exhausted exhale and disappeared. Unsure what happened, Miguel keyed up his radio and said, "Dispatch, I did not copy. Come back. Over." Miguel waited for only a second before storing his mic and bringing his focus back to the scene. The light from his mag light lit up the grass around the man. At first, Miguel was hesitant to move him. However, because he was able to walk such a far distance from the crash site, Miguel thought it was probably okay enough to roll him over. There was blood and dried, crusted vomit around his mouth. There were many abrasions on his face, but nothing that appeared to be life-threatening. Miguel was unsure what to make of the man in the grass. Did he crash because he became sick while driving, or did he get sick because of the shock and stress of the crash? Miguel looked down and said, "If you can hear me, I'll be right back. Help is on the way. Just hang tight, okay?" He stood up and quickly walked back to the smashed Subaru. Once there, he smelled the horrible sickness seeping out from inside the car. Miguel looked inside the shattered window. There was vomit all over. The steering wheel and center console were covered in it. Thick yellow fluid ran slowly down what was left of the spider-webbed front windshield. At the sight of the dripping bile, Miguel remembered his wife on the toilet for hours with explosive diarrhea, while vomiting into a beige plastic trash can. Every day for weeks, Miguel tended to the mess after she was stable enough to try and sleep. The day she passed, he smashed that beige trash can into sharp plastic shards and left them on the bathroom floor. The shards sat there overnight before Danny found them and cleaned them up the next day. He was the best friend anyone could ask for. And in Miguel's darkest time, Danny was there for him. He cleaned the house for him. He cooked for him. He made sure he didn't climb too far inside that bottle of whiskey that he couldn't climb out. It's not likely that Miguel would be the person he is today without Danny there, pulling him through in his darkest hour. Tires screeched from behind Miguel, breaking his thoughts. Sheet metal crunched and glass shattered in several tremendous explosions. Miguel acted on pure instincts as he kept his head low and took several skipping steps away from the commotion. The thunderous crunching echoed off the nearby rolling hills. One of the cars smashed into the pileup and deflected off, spinning, only to roll out of control down the steep embankment on the west side of the highway. At first, Miguel thought the car may get stuck at the bottom where the steep grade levels to flat, but it did not. The out-of-control car rolled and rolled until it crashed into the mangled Subaru holding up the leaning transmission tower. Miguel held his breath for what could have been an eternity. Almost everything went silent, and all he heard was the western breeze whipping through the nearby live oaks. After several seconds, Miguel let out a sigh of relief. Then it happened. He heard the awful sound of metal gouging metal. The awful noise grew louder as the steel poles tore through the hood of the small car. Above him, he heard the creak of metal bending and the sound of cables being stretched. Then there were several loud pops as the tower slowly began to lean more and more. It continued to lean until leaning turned into falling. There was a tremendous crash that shook the ground, and an unfathomable amount of dust plumed into the dark sky. Electrical arcs flew everywhere as the live wires danced about, almost as if being whipped around by some unseen deity. The sound of metal being welded together echoed off the surrounding hills. Miguel heard people screaming in pain, shock, or agony. He wasn't sure which. He turned and ran full speed back to the cruiser. Once back at the car, Miguel looked around, but Danny wasn't there. He called out, "Danny, where are you?" He ran around the car to find Danny sitting on the ground, leaned back against the passenger side door. His legs extended out flat, and there was vomit on his shirt and pants. "Hey, man, we gotta go," Miguel said. But if all the noise and crashing cars above hadn't made him aware of that by now, then telling him probably wouldn't make any difference. Miguel opened the rear passenger side door and lifted him up from his underarms and wrestled him into the back seat. He closed the door, got in, and drove off, heading south on the frontage road on the east side of Highway 101. They were lower than the highway above, so the pileup wasn't visible. He did, however, see the reflecting lights that illuminated the hillside to the east. Lights danced off the oaks and rolling hills from the live wires and small fires on the highway. People screamed out in pain, trapped in their mangled cars, being burned alive. Miguel rolled up his window to make the horrible screams go away. As soon as the air stopped whipping through the driver's side window, Miguel heard Danny heaving and gagging in the back seat. He heaved so hard, Miguel thought he would pass out from lack of oxygen, pain, or maybe both. The pungent smell of bile was throughout the entire car and close to making Miguel sick. Once out of earshot from the crash, Miguel rolled the window down halfway again. The roads were pitch dark and none of the streetlights were working. The only other sources of light were the light bar and the headlights of the cruiser. It was so dark in the back, Miguel couldn't see Danny lying on the seat. There was only a vague outline in the place Miguel had laid him down. Miguel shook his head with sympathy for his best friend and said, "Hang in there, man. I'm going to get you to the hospital, I promise." Danny said nothing. He just lay there in the dark, making inaudible, bubbling noises. Then Miguel remembered about dispatch and quickly keyed up the mic. "Dispatch, you copy? Over." First there was nothing but static. Then it sounded like the mic was being keyed up, but they said nothing. Miguel knew something was amiss, so he said, "Dispatch, if you copy, be advised. The code 14 on 101 southbound is snafu. Be advised, Officer Lewis is in need of medical attention. We are en route to AGC. Over. Then he released the button on the mic and waited. After a minute of no response, he hung up the transmitter and glanced in the mirror. Danny was still hidden in the blackness of the early morning shadows. Miguel was almost thankful for the darkness in the back, so he wouldn't have to watch his partner suffer. Miguel began to speak to his longtime friend. So, what do you think? Think it's possible they're all sick too? I mean, the tow truck operator was sick, and you're sick. The man back at the scene of the crash was definitely sick, and now dispatch isn't responding? But they always respond. Danny didn't answer, nor did Miguel expect him to. He was just thinking out loud. The streetlights were out, and the 15-minute drive to the hospital took more than 20. Danny heaved, choked, and gagged off and on the entire way. At 5:31 a.m., Miguel made the final left turn and found a half mile of stopped traffic stood between them and the hospital. Miguel lightly banged his forehead on the steering wheel and cursed. God damn it! He scanned their surroundings, looking for any other way to get Danny to the hospital, but there was none. He would have to walk to the hospital and bring back a wheelchair. Then he could roll Danny in. Miguel turned off the siren, but left the light bar on. The red and blue lights reflected off the cars in front of them, lighting up the dawn like a colorful strobe light. As he walked past the car in front of them, an older lady with gray hair stepped out of her mid-'80s model Oldsmobile. She noticeably staggered and then leaned over and rested against the fender of her car, tipped her head down, and vomited blood on the fender. Her knees quaked before they gave out and she fell to the ground. Miguel sprinted to the lady and knelt down to offer assistance. Her forehead slammed against the fender, leaving a dent on the metal corner. He checked her pulse. There was none. He rubbed his temples and let out a frustrated breath. Then, as respectfully as he could, he picked up her light, frail body and placed her inside the blue Oldsmobile and closed the door. 2 vehicles ahead of the elderly lady's Oldsmobile was a car with a red-headed woman in the driver's seat. Miguel walked alongside of the red all-wheel drive Subaru Outback. In the back seat were 2 young children, a girl and a boy. The lady, whom Miguel guessed to be the mother, sat in the driver's seat with her head back, looking up at the tan roofliner. Her head pitched forward under the steering wheel, and she began to dribble and shudder. Just as Miguel was about to open the door and offer aid to the lady, her head fell limp and the shuddering stopped. Miguel didn't bother checking her pulse. He turned his attention to the 2 children in the back seat, both of them still strapped into their car seats. The little girl wore flannel pajamas that were covered in vomit. Her head hung limp against her right shoulder. Having had enough death for one day, Miguel almost didn't look at the other child, but he forced himself to look. The boy looked to be 4 or 5 years old. He wore black and white, long-sleeved Pokemon pajamas. His cheeks were slick with tears, and thick green snot clung to his little red nostrils. Miguel slowly opened the door and said, "Hey, big guy." It took a few seconds, but the boy finally looked in Miguel's direction. There was no acknowledgement in the child's eyes, only a blank 1,000-yard stare. The kid was traumatized from watching his mother and sister die throwing up all over themselves. Miguel spoke again. "Hey, big guy, how old are you? So you like Pokemon, huh?" He nodded his head and held up 5 shaking fingers. Before he dropped his chin to his chest, huge alligator tears ran down his rosy red cheeks. Miguel wrestled his light brown hair with his right hand through the open door. "Hey, have you ever met a real-life police officer before?" The boy lifted his face and looked at Miguel. Snot bubbled from his little nose. He raised his right arm, and with one long swipe he smeared the snot across his face. Then his top lip started to quiver as he stuttered, "No." Miguel leaned in for a closer look of the boy and noticed the bottom of his pajamas were wet. He pissed himself. Miguel needed to get him away from his dying mother and sister. "Is this your mother sleeping?" The boy nodded his head and said, "Is your daddy at home?" The boy shook his head and seemed surprised at the question, so Miguel said, "Do you have a daddy?" The boy said, Mommy says Daddy's with God and one day I'll get to meet him." Miguel smiled at the boy. "I'm sure you will, young man. But for now, would you like to go with me and let your mommy and sister sleep for a while? I have a real cop car and I'll even let you play with the lights. So what do you say?" The boy nodded his head and said, Mommy said I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." "Your mommy taught you well, but this time I think it's okay. Plus, we're not going anywhere. My car's right there." Miguel pointed behind him and continued, "You can see the lights flashing from here. Look." The boy twisted in his booster seat and looked out the back window. Then he seemed to forget all about his mother and sister and said, "Does it have a radio? Not like a radio with music, but a real radio where people get helped?" Miguel laughed slightly. "It sure does. What do you say? You will come with me?" As the boy unbuckled his seatbelt, he smiled and said, "Oh, yes, please." Miguel would need this kid's address, so he reached in and took hold of his mother's purse. He removed her wallet and saw her driver's license had a local address. He took it and dropped it into his right front breast pocket. The kid grabbed some kind of tablet and brought it back to the cruiser with him. Once back at the cruiser, Miguel got the boy sitting down in the front seat playing on his tablet. While he was occupied with his device, Miguel walked around the car to check on Danny. He was half in the seat. His body twisted at the waist and his feet were on the floor. Miguel did need to check his pulse to see if Danny was alive or not. This concludes Chapter 2 of The Day the Dead Rose by A.R. Pearson. Please like, share, and subscribe for upcoming videos. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.